In United States Government Book, we're in Chapter 3 now, The Shaping of the American Republic. And some of our highlights here, you see the English heritage, that we have an English heritage in America. The English tradition takes root in America. The steps towards unity and a nation is born when America was born with the Declaration of Independence. So this video is going to be focused on the English heritage and looking back at that. And so let's, first of all, some of these quotes, I'm going to read them because it really shows forth how much our country depended on our English heritage. So John Fiske, what does he write? It is to the fortunate alliance of that fervent religious enthusiasm of the Puritans, which the Englishman's love of self-government, that our modern freedom owes its existence. So what is he saying? He's saying that we are so fortunate that we have an alliance of our Pilgrim Puritan background of religious enthusiasm that unites with the Englishman's love of self-government, the love of government. And this has led to our freedom that we have today. So, great quote. Let's go on to what President Theodore Roosevelt says. Every thinking man, when he thinks, realizes that the teachings of the Bible are so interwoven and entwined with our whole civic and social life that it would be literally, I do not mean figuratively, I mean literally, impossible for us to figure to ourselves what that life would be if these teachings were removed. We would lose almost all the standards by which we now judge both public and private morals, all the standards toward which we live, with more or less of resolution, strive to raise ourselves. So what is he saying? Basically saying how important the Bible is, and has it been interwoven and entwined in our whole society that we live now. So it's impossible if we didn't have the Bible to figure out what our country would be like. You can imagine. So that's basically what Teddy Roosevelt is saying. So let's talk about this English heritage. Let's find out how it really affects our lives today and affects our government. To understand America's unique form of government and how it came to be, we must look to the history of England. Where we inherited in England, we inherited our love for freedom and our political principles of limited represented government. And we can focus on the influence of the scriptures and how the scriptures influenced our English heritage. So God's word gave England the foundation to develop. First of all, we had a common language with England. Second of all, we had the written law, their law, which influenced us. And third, England had a stable government at the time, and that stable government influenced America. So back to that English inheritance, it was on a common language, the written law, common law, and onto a stable government. So American government is founded on biblical principles such as was the English at that time. So we're going to talk about how Christianity came to England and how Christianity affected the foundations of those pilgrims and those Puritans that had come to found our nation on the Bible and on those biblical principles. So in the English heritage, let's talk about a little bit about the history of England here. So, sorry, here we go. So the history of England, okay. The history of England is a story of conquest by the Romans, by the Anglo-Saxons, by the Danes, and by the Normans. And each one of these new groups settled in England during certain time periods and brought their language, their culture, and all of their beliefs. The Romans in particular at that time had a military rule when Rome conquered the world, and they ruled over the Celts. And the Celts, you think of Celtic, you think of Ireland for sure, but the Romans actually, during that time, ruled with the Celts, and in came the Anglo-Saxons with the fall of Rome, and founded dozens of independent kingdoms in this area. And doing this, they forced, a lot of the Celts out. A lot of them went into Ireland in that area. And also, a lot of them were killed in the midst of that. And then the Normans introduced feudalism, which were kings and queens and lords and vassals and all these things you see back in the time of the medieval times, the Middle Ages, introduced feudalism. On to all of this. When we look at all of this, all of what was going on here, and we think, well, of course, Romans, Anglo-Saxons, Danes, onto even the Celtic groups and all such, you would think that they would have a monarchy, a powerful monarchy with kings and queens, or a dictatorship. You would never ever think that they would have developed a representative government at all. So the greatest influences then at this time, were they the Romans? Were they the Anglo-Saxons? Were they the Danes, or were they the Normans? What was it? Yes, the greatest influence of England at this time was the Bible. The Bible was the greatest influence. When we go through all of these cultures and coming back, what influenced our English heritage, that we developed from England, was the fact the Bible had been introduced to England, changing their government. So let's talk about the Bible and Christianity in England. Go on to this next picture, maybe. Hey, yeah, this is John Wycliffe there. Picture. So, the Bible in England. Okay, let's go back to the Roman occupation. Remember when the Celts were converted in the 5th century? This is way back in the 5th century. When you think 5th century, you're thinking quite a few years ago, and 400 and 500, 400s, at the time. So we're thinking back, this is even just after when we think of St. Patrick in Ireland and England and Anglo-Saxons. Well, the Roman occupation was during that time, and then the Anglo-Saxon pagan invasion came through, killing, like I said before, a lot of the Celtic Christians that had become Christians were pushed out or enslaved or killed at that time, or persecuted. So as the Anglo-Saxons came in and through this whole situation, the Roman government at that time, when you say the Roman popes or the Roman Catholicism, sent Augustine, their so-called not Saint Augustine when we think of Augustine of Hippo, but another Augustine. But they sent this monk actually in a monk missionary. It was sent by Pope Gregory, and this is about 597 AD. And then on to 664 AD, most of England at that time was Roman Catholic, and they read a Bible called the Latin Vulgate Bible. But the Bible was in Latin, and not a single Englishman could understand Latin, of course. So only the monks and priests could read Latin, if that. And so whenever they thought about translating it, every single translation of the Latin Vulgate was discouraged by the Catholic Church at that time. They did not want England to have its English translation, and believed that any other translations were to them were not of God, or were not liable. So, but the English Bible was translated by some pretty bold men. Here's two names. We have John Wycliffe, and we have, or John Wycliffe, I should pronounce his name, and we have William Tyndale. John Wycliffe basically translated the Latin Vulgate parts of it, many parts of it, into the English language and gave out pamphlets and such. And, you know, at that time, the English Bible just spread like mad. And there was actually revivals going on as people read the English Bible, parts of it. And then on to William Tyndale, who translated from the original Greek and Hebrew until the Roman Church destroyed many of these English Bibles, his translations. And then they took William Tyndale and burned him at the stake. He became a martyr. It was too late, though, because a lot of his English Bibles were taken and read by a lot of people, and a lot of people hearing the gospel at that time and having their English Bible became excited about what God was showing to them through the Bible and how God's Spirit was moving them. And so we were having a starting of the revival in England at this time. So the influence, God preserved his word, and his influence spread among the people of England. And this caused, in the mid-1500s, an English Reformation. An English Reformation, those turning to the Bible and basically being revived during this time. Rome's grip on England was broken then, and the Bible became available to all Englishmen in their native tongue. And by the 17th century, we had some great translations of the Bible, one being the Geneva Bible. And that Bible, very, very famous, beautiful Bible, 1560. And then the authorized version will be the King James Version in 1611. And now people could have Bibles even in their homes. So this caused revival. When people read their Bible, they were revived to faith in God. So that was basically, you know, where England began hearing the gospel and presenting, you know, their lives, you know, in reading the Bible, and onto that also affecting what's called English common law. English common law. You're thinking, what is English common law? So common law in itself, right here, common law is a non-codified form of law based on long accepted customs and tradition. When you think of common law, you're looking back at tradition. It's not written down, but it's the natural law of that of the customs of that certain ethnic group, right? So common law, you think, is non-codified. That means not written down form of law based on customs and traditions. And so the English common law had several sources, of course, because they were affected by different ethnic groups coming in, different cultures. And so we think of, yes, they were based on Anglo-Saxon, Jewish, Viking, Roman. The ecclesiastic church, the first church, had missionaries in that area, especially when you think of St. Patrick, you know, Patrick coming into that area, well, basically into Ireland. And many were influenced by the scriptures. So let's talk about how these scriptures influenced. I'll come back to this focus here. This focus is pretty good right here when we're talking about the pilgrims and how they brought their tradition, their custom, but more than that, they brought their Christian faith to America. And we'll go over that in a little bit. But let's go back with this English heritage. So the first, going back all the way to 848 to 899, lived one of the first kings. When they go back to the times of the kings, when we call a king, was Alfred the Great. And Alfred the Great was a born-again Christian. He had heard the gospel, and he prefaced his English law, his law code that he set down with what? The 10 Commandments. So he said his laws were going to be based on the 10 Commandments. And that was one of the first recorded kings, you know, as for kings that ruled over the whole country of England. And he looked towards the 10 Commandments. I think that is really important to look back at England and think that despite all of the different pagan, you know, religions and all of these different groups that came in, settled at this time in hearing the gospel with a King Alfred. On to Henry de Bracton. So remember these names. Henry de Bracton will be called the father of common law. And he wrote the first treatise on American common law. So when you think about common law, you need to remember Henry de Bracton, father of common law. He spelled out the relationship between God and law and the king. He said the king himself, right here, the king himself ought not to be under man, but under God and under the law, because the law makes the king. So he's saying, yes, it's important that the king, and the king's not God, that the king be under law and under God. So that's where he based his common law. And he referred to this as Jesus did, that Jesus willingly submitted himself to the law so that he might redeem those under the law. That's in Galatians 4:4-5. And if Jesus submitted himself to the law, then all kings must do the same. And so this is the rule of law. We see the principle of the rule of law in triumph of the rule of man now. The rule of law says that everyone is subject to the law. So what he was saying, everyone is subject to law, even the king. This was important because a lot of kings felt that they were not subject to God or subject to anyone. And a lot of them thought that they themselves were to be worshipped, that they were gods. And so he was saying that basically the point that when you think of Henry de Bracton was that under the common law that all were subject to the law of God, to the rule of law. An important foundation there. And on to another important commentary on common law was Sir Edward Coke. Sir Edward Coke was, you remember by his writing of the Institutes of Common Law. So he too, as well as de Bracton, Henry de Bracton and Coke, both wrote on English common law. And basically Coke reflected on the Christian roots of common law, basically saying common law should be based on Christianity. And so, in fact, it says here, he was standing before King James I of England, and this is what he said. He said, the law of nature is that which God at that time of creation of nature of man infused into this the lex eterna, which means moral law, called also the law of nature. And by this law, written with the finger of God in the heart of man, were the people of God a long time governed before the law was written down by Moses, who was the first reporter or writer of the law in the world. So basically what he was saying is that there's another law, and this law is not the written down law. There was a law before that God wrote on the hearts of men. And this is what he called the law of nature, or that law that was preserved, as for common law, is that conscience that God has given us, right? And so basically that's what Sir Edward Coke says. We have a law of nature, and that law of nature is what God has written in our hearts of our conscience and what is right and what is wrong before it was written on the Ten Commandments. Before Moses wrote it down, they already knew the Ten Commandments on their heart. And don't we? There's a lot of cultures that know what's right and wrong that have never ever read the Bible. So that was his heart, was that Edward Coke wrote about the Institutes of Common Law, and that municipal law, immutable law that God writes on our hearts. And the next, this is the most important one. You're going to hear about him a lot, even in America, because a lot of our founding fathers read his books on law. So the third important commentary was Sir William Blackstone. And like Coke, he distinguished between natural, moral law of God, writing that law on our hearts, written on the hearts of man to give us human reason. And then he also talked about the revealed law through the Holy Scriptures, and that law revealed by Moses in the Bible. And that how that law would be superior to the law written on the hearts, because man's hearts can be changed and can be deceitfully wicked beyond measure, and we can sear our conscience, can we? Not, of course we can, So the Holy Scripture is saying no. If your hearts and minds are perverted, and you're not thinking about conscience, and your conscience is being seared, we have the written law to tell us the truth, and that written law being those commandments from the Bible. So going on here, here's a picture of Sir Edward Coke, one of the guys that we're talking about that wrote the Institutes of Common Law. Here's how they looked back then. So Blackstone, let's go back to Blackstone, because Blackstone's really the guy you're going to have to remember the most. And basically, the reason we think about Blackstone is, number one, because he taught about the grounding of the common law as being God revealing that law. And then he also said, that would be natural law, and then also the revealed law. So he stipulated between those two laws, our conscience, that law in our heart, and onto the law written, the revealed through the Bible. He also was the most important legal commentary to all of our forefathers in America. They all read his legal commentary, which meant they all read about the law. And so when the Americans came, they focused on establishing our law in America on a lot of Blackstone's ideas. In fact, basically it says Commentaries on Laws of England was the preferred legal text in the United States during the 20th century. So this Commentaries of Laws of England was read all over the United States. And so even common people and any educated people would read these and focus on what our laws should be like. So let's go on a little bit more in history. On to that. First of all, it says up here, I like this part. It says, not everything in common law was good. Some of it was rooted in pagan practices too. But Scripture throughout was dynamic in common law. So it was moving all the way through. And no matter what part of England or what religious sect you were in the midst of England, that you focused on the law as being dynamic and from the Bible, as England looked to the Bible. So King Henry II ruled 1154 to 1189. So he strengthened common law, and he made a system of royal courts, and he created these courts to administer the law. One of the first kings that really focused on the law. He said, we're going to set forth these common law. Now, they weren't written down yet, but he knew some of the things that were important, and he sent these royal courts to make sure that they administered to the people the law. One was trial by jury. Trial by jury is very, very important in England's royal courts. Why? Because it was a giant step towards legal principles and equal justice. That every single person or citizen would have justice, equal justice, not just because they were wealthy or poor, that they would have justice under a trial by jury. A jury of their peers would come and view, and the person was said to be innocent until proven guilty. So this is a big foundational thing even in America, and we're talking way back in the 1100s. Oh my goodness, that King Henry set down this trial by jury. So before this time, it was very pagan-like, in finding if someone was guilty or not guilty, or justice. They actually took place by a trial by ordeal. So what was the trial by ordeal? The trial by ordeal was basically, the trial by ordeal where a man's innocence was determined by his surviving some dangerous ritual. So trial by ordeal was that they would put somebody and say, okay, if they survive, be eaten by this lion, or if they survive this terrible situation, God must be protecting them, so they must be innocent. I don't know where they got that one. And so before this also was a trial by combat. Of course, we talk about combat, and a lot of times we'll talk about duels. And so basically they would get into these duels, and the person that won the duel and was not killed, they said was the one that God probably protected. Now, maybe not these days, we see that, but they called this the trial by combat, is they would put him in combat and see when they fought, you would fight your accuser, and if you died, then your accuser won the situation, won the justice over. So now we see how much trial by jury was a giant step towards the justice of law, equal justice for law, So common law and the trial by jury gave stability to the English people at this time. So even as the rulers fought with each other and other nations, they would come back to the basic common law and to the trials by jury now instead. And of course, common law was influenced by scriptures, and so it became the primary law and the vital role in shaping the English government, right? So think of common law, you think of influenced by what? By the Bible. So let's go on here. The English government. So the English government, the reason we're learning all this is because it affects America, because a lot of the way we handled our government in the beginning had to do the way England had been founded. The English government had been founded. So the Anglo-Saxon rulers developed limited representative government. That's very important. They developed this limited representative government. Let me pull up a layer a little bit. There we go. Here's a picture of trial by jury here and trial by combat. Oh, that was replaced by, so it's not, this is trial by jury, and it's a lot different than the combat, right? But anyway, let's go back to this English government here. So limited representative government was the rule of law. Limited means what? That the king's power was limited by rival powers, or sometimes it was limited by rival powers or aristocracy, which the aristocrats, ruled under the king, and they'd have advisory councils to the king. So the king's power was already limited, but they wanted to lead to representative government and have a Bill of Rights, basically having the people to elect representatives, or the people to have representatives and a Bill of Rights. So the people would be represented to the king in what their needs were. So the people's customs and traditions were in high regard, and there were a lot of nobles at this time. So people had influence in judicial decisions under the trial by jury, and this checked the power of the king, so the king would not become so powerful. So it'd be a rule by law rather than a rule by men, this representative government, so this limited government. Let's talk about this history of the limited government. It began under the Anglo-Saxon kings. We're going all the way Anglo-Saxons, all back to Alfred the Great, one of the first Anglo-Saxon kings. And they had what was called a witan. A witan was a council of wise men that were noble, and not only wise men, but also some of them were in the clergy. When I say priests, they were priests or pastors. They're basically holding positions of nobility. And they aided the king in making his important decisions. And then in when the Normans came in from, when we talk about that area in 1066, they replaced the witan with two other bodies. And these two other bodies were called the Magnum Consulum, which means Great Council, and it consisted of the king's vassals and also a king's court. So they had basically, you'll see two things: the Great Council and the king's court. So now going back here, so the first guys were the Witens, and the Witens were under the Anglo-Saxons, and then they came under the Great Council and onto the King's Court. So this was a representative government, and basically that would come to be through this. So basically you had a king that was limited by his council and the King's Court. So on to the representative government in 1265. So now we have this guy coming in. His name's Simon de Montfort. Simon de Montfort, as you can see, is a French nobleman, but he's also in England. But in the midst of all this, he comes in, and the Great Council were being referred now to what was called the Parliament. So Simon de Montfort, he's like the beginning of what we call the Parliament. Parler means French, and it means to speak. So parler means to speak to the king, really. So Simon de Montfort gained temporary control of the English government during this time, and so he called representatives of the shires are the different counties, and different towns, to sit together with the nobles and the clergymen of the Great Council. And this was the first meeting of the Parliament. The beginning of representative government in England was the Parliament. Now the Parliament would come, parler meaning, those nobles and such, those representatives of all the different shires would come in and bring in their representatives to the king. And so just remember, Simon de Montfort. So Edward I, he lived 1272 to 1307. And Edward, he conveyed the model parliament in 1295. So let's go back here. Where was it? 1265, 30 years later. We have Edward coming in. He's King Edward of England, and he's putting forth a model parliament. Well, the reason he put this model parliament wasn't the best of reasons, because he wanted to raise some money, and he thought, he's going to bring in this nobility and everything and have them come in as a parliament so he can levy some taxes towards them with the Great Council. And this would permit money to come to him so that he could levy these taxes for his great wars, because he was involved in wartime and wanted more money. So he didn't have the best of intentions, but he did set forth a model parliament. And by summoning the parliament, this gave the assembly an unprecedented authority, basically saying what affects all by all should be approved. So what affects all by all should be approved, right here, the approval. And what affects all by all should be approved. And so in the midst of this, initially the parliament had three different classes of people when they came together. So what people were coming in the parliament? First, you had the nobles and the clergymen. Now there were three classes. First, the nobles. They basically were the very wealthy people, the nobles and such, and they had, a lot of them had their little lordships, they would call it, in the feudal system. And then they had clergy. The clergy, of course, would be those that were religious, the religious men. When you would talk about, those religious men that held power, whether they be monks or priests or pastors or whatever, but the clergymen. And the third would be all of the representatives of the shires and towns from the common people. And so later they just divide this into two houses. Instead of three groups of people, the nobles and the clergy went together, and they called themselves the House of Lords, right? And so they went together, and they were the upper class. And then they formed the lower group. Lower class was called the House of Commons. And that included all of these representatives from the common people. And this started way back when, so we're talking from 1295 on, so this was a long time ago. And so in the midst of all this, we had that struggle, but under the common people by that time in the Parliament, the time of the Tudors. When you think of Tudors, you think of Henry VIII, all the way down through Elizabeth, and then we think of the Stuarts. And this is during the times of 1485 to 1603 and down to 1603 to 1700. The Parliament had become very important, the most important legal system of the people of England. And later the Parliament would become the model for the colonial legislation in America and for the United States Congress. So our government would actually model on the representative of all of these people as they got together to represent different counties. Now we do that with our states, don't we, and our towns and our counties, when we elect. So it's similar to what would happen at the Parliament. Our type of Parliament was not considered Parliament, of course. It's going to be considered Congress. So we can see that. I'm going to go on and finish this because we're almost done. Because for one thing, they were more than just the struggle for liberty, would be more than just a parliament. What would the parliament be based on? So it says, as always the case, the path to freedom was very difficult, and the people of England were struggling for many years to secure and maintain their freedoms, liberties, through a limited representative government. But there were two documents during this time that were most important in England. And that basically we can take these documents and see how they affected our Constitution, in the midst, in our documents, and even our Declaration of Independence. So these two documents go back for the first to 1199 to 1216. When you think of this time, I always think the times of Robin Hood, because it was King John. King John was a very bad ruler, and he just thought he could get his own way. We have King Richard the Lionheart. Remember, you get that when you watch the movie on Robin Hood. But King Richard the Lionheart was a good king, and when he died, his brother was King John that ruled during this time, and the nobles, no one wanted to go by what King John would say. He was a hated king. And he tried to curtail the freedoms for the people. He didn't really care if the people had freedoms. And so the barons or the nobles, they got together and they wanted to restore English law and English common law custom. And so they compelled John to submit to the Magna Carta, which means the Great Charter. And so here's a picture of it right here. Very famous, this Magna Carta. And this, I was on June 15th, 1215. Just remember 15, right? So June 15th, 1215. This was the first time in history that the king was placed under the law, because they said that King John, you are going to be under the law. You just can't do whatever you want. We now are placing you under the law. And the Magna Carta contains it was like a constitution. It contains some very important things that we have in our Constitution. First, number one, there was no taxation without representation. So that means that you couldn't tax the people unless the people were represented in the parliament, or basically not as a parliament at that time, that they'd be represented to the king. There'd be no taxation without representation. Number two, there was the right of habeas corpus. That means to produce a person in court, to testify. And there'd also be trial by jury and a due process of law. Everything would go through the law. The king just couldn't say, oh, this guy needs to be killed, or oh, this guy needs to be put in prison for no good reason. And so the Magna Carta was so important. And then on to another document that happened later on, and this was the English Bill of Rights. Here's the English Bill of Rights. The English Bill of Rights was under another king named Charles I, and this is later on, 1625 to 1649. This is the time that the Pilgrims came in 1620. So this is the time America was beginning. So Charles II, and that's how we have, Carolina, the Carolinas that were named by after King Charles. Charles the First was I said Charles II, but Charles the First was the king at this time. And he tried to ignore the freedoms of the Magna Carta, saying, no, the king is like God. He felt like he was right up there with God, and he didn't need any to be under the law. So the House of Commons forced him then to to take away his power in 1620A to assent and to petition, to basically a petition of a right, it said. And then it brought him into the Civil War during that time in England. And so, which we won't go into the whole Civil War there that's going on. On to the Glorious Revolution of 1688 at this time. And all of this placed all of these monarchs, these kings come from Charles I under the law. So the monarchs, which were the kings and queens, were strictly limited by the English Bill of Rights in 1689. And so this is what the Bill of Rights declared in 1699. It declared the following. Number 1, no man is above the law. So the pretended power of the suspending laws or execution of laws by regal authority without consent of the Parliament is illegal. So basically that's just saying no man is above the law. So number 2, there shall be no taxes without consent. You can't levy money by pretense, just, in that point, and taxing them without Parliament giving them the right to do that. So otherwise, taxation with just what you want to tax people on. And the people may petition for a redress of grievances. It is the right of the subjects to petition the king. That means the people can petition the king. Number 4, the people have a right to keep and bear arms, guns, and armory. So the people have the right to keep and bear arms. The subjects, which are Protestants, may have arms for their defense, it says. Number 5, elections must be free. The elections of the members of Parliament ought to be free. Not forced that you have to pay for elections. Number 6, the people's representatives must have freedom of speech. The freedom of speech in the Parliament ought not to be impeached or questioned in any court of place out of the Parliament. Basically giving the people's rights that freedom of speech. Number 7, neither bail nor fines may be excessive, giving them excessive fines, and punishment may not be cruel. So that's number 7, is basically saying that there should not be any cruel or unusual punishment of people as they hold them, in a court case, or hold them. So the English Bill of Rights was in, this whole English Bill of Rights was in 1689. And you can remember, this was the beginning of America. America had, been the beginnings of America for like 80 years during this time, 1620 to so almost 80 years. And America would benefit from the English struggle for their own legal and political system. So that's basically the beginnings of English law. Kind of a quick history, isn't it? Let's go over this section review really quick because these are pretty easy questions and we've gone over them. What has been the greatest influence on England's law and government? Number 1 and only one, the Bible, is the answer to that. Number 2, name 2 men who translated the scriptures into the English language. The translation of the English Bible are Wycliffe and Tyndale, right? Hope you got that one. Number 3, who is known as the father of the common law? The father of the common law was Harry de Bracton. So that's in your book. Number 4, by what year had the Great Council become known as the Parliament? In the year 1265 by Montfort. The French put together the Parliament, Parler. So, and that was in 1265. Number 5, who summoned the model Parliament in what year? So the first model Parliament was Edward I, and it was in 1295. 1265 is when Parliament came to be, and 30 years later was the model Parliament, and that was in 1295. And Edward summoned it because he wanted to make some money off, get some money for his wars. On to number 6, name the 2 divisions within the English Parliament. Well, we have the House of Lords and the House of Commons, right? The top house was the House of Lords. The bottom was the House of Commons. Number 7, in what year did King John consent to the Magna Carta? What was the year of the Magna Carta? June 15, 1215. Just remember, June 15, 1215, long time ago. And that Magna Carta set forth like a constitution for them. Number 8, name 2 important political principles found in the Magna Carta. So no taxation without representation would be one, and trial by jury. Those are the 2 most important. Trial by jury and no taxation without representation. And then number 9 says, when was the English Bill of Rights drafted, and lists 7 important political principles found. We went over these already with that English Bill of Rights. We just went over those. You could just turn the page back and look right here, and then we'll have those 7 things we just went over. So, and when was the English Bill of Rights drafted? It was drafted in 1689, the year. Okay, so let's stop there, and then we'll go on to the next. It's going to have to do with the English tradition takes root in America.